And we're live. Welcome to another episode of the .NET Doc Show. And this is 60 minutes of unscripted .NET entertainment. As doctors of .NET, we prescribe healthy choices in .NET, which may include a low-fat diet high in vitamins C sharp and F sharp. I will point out that vitamin C sharp is important. For
But what about vitamin VB?
I was gonna ask that. The VB folks are gonna get mad at you, man.
Sorry, it just didn't work. We like to be as inclusive as possible on this show, but yeah, I just couldn't work the VB in there. Open to suggestions. Anyways, I'm your host, Scott Addy, with co-hosts Cecil Phillip and Cam Soper. I'd like to welcome today's guest, Niels Swimberghe, fantastic community member we have who is an absolute machine writing some awesome content on his blog. Niels, why don't you just spend a couple of minutes introducing yourself?
Yes, hello. My name is Niels Swimberghe, also known as Swimberghe. I'm a .NET developer and a tech content creator on the side, and I blog at swimberghe.net. And I do .NET development at MetaStar Systems. We're always looking for awesome people to join our ranks. So that's it.
Awesome. So with that, why don't we get some vitamin C sharp in our checkup segment? All right, so our checkup doc for today is actually a Microsoft Learn module. If you haven't heard of Microsoft Learn, this is essentially a replacement for our Microsoft Virtual Academy that you may have used back in the day. It's all about providing a sort of at your own pace learning environment with knowledge checks scattered throughout to validate that you're retaining the knowledge we're trying to teach you. What we have
Scott,
here. Go ahead.
I have a question real quick. What's that level 5 and those numbers and stuff in the upper right of your browser there?
Great question. So this XP represents, I believe, experience points. With each module that you complete on the Learn platform, you earn experience points. Each module has a different value of experience points, typically based on the complexity of the module. This particular module, as you can see up here, is going to earn you 1,300 experience points upon completion.
So when you level up, do you get to pick new skills?
Yeah, so I mean, essentially you can see I'm a total noob because I've got 1,500 experience points. I've got some work there to do.
I feel like this is a really good opportunity for us to have a competition. We should have like a competition either between like the hosts or the hosts and the guests to see who can level up the most by the end of the month.
Yep. So we do have, occasionally we have what we call Learn challenges that do just what Cecil described. It's all about, establishing a leaderboard, trying to, compete with your colleagues, your friends, and just, trying to see who can complete the most modules in a particular learning path or discipline on the Learn platform. For example, we might have a microservices themed Learn challenge, which I believe was an actual thing, where you try to complete as many modules in that microservices learning path as you can in a 1 month period. But anyways, getting over to the checkup doc for today, this one is focused on publishing a Blazor WebAssembly app and a supporting Azure Functions API written in .NET to a static hosting platform called Azure Static Web Apps. This is a newer-ish offering on the Azure platform. If you haven't heard of it, this is a great way to learn about it. Estimated completion time for this particular module is roughly 38 minutes. This is the landing page for the module. You'll see there are some prereqs here. Essentially what you need is a GitHub account, and the reason for the GitHub account is you're going to be asked to clone some code from a GitHub repo down to your machine, and that code represents the starter application. You're also going to need Visual Studio 2019. If you don't have VS 2019, no problem. You could do this in VS Code as well. We recognize that not everybody is using Windows. Also the .NET Core SDK, which you can actually install through Visual Studio 2019 if you select the ASP.NET and web development workload. Now, the starter app that I mentioned, living in the GitHub repo, I actually have that pulled up over here. So over here in Octotree, you can kind of see the structure of what that starter app is. Up here,
no, Scott, hold on, Scott, hold on. You're just so casual. Over here in Octotree, right? I love it when people drop these extensions, like these really cool, life-changing extensions that are just like, oh, I've been using this every day. Where have you been?
Yeah, so Octotree is a very, very useful extension for GitHub. I believe there's a paid tier of it now, but for me, what I use it for is I come out to a GitHub repo like this, and I want to just quickly navigate the directory structure in that repo to see what's there. It's also extremely useful for reviewing pull requests. You get the directory structure view of what's in the pull request. So rather than trying to parse the long paths to the files in the pull request, you get a better view of it here in the form of a tree.
File that under features that GitHub forgot, right?
Yeah. So thank you for stopping me there. Definitely check out Octotree. Maybe we'll put that in the chat for folks who are interested. This starter app, you'll see 3 directories out here in this repo. There's an API directory, and that's the .NET Core 3.1 Azure Functions API project. Beneath that, we have the Blazor WebAssembly project, and that's actually targeting .NET Standard 2.1. And then finally, we have a very, very simple .NET Standard 2.0 products data project. Now, I should say, this sample app here is a home shopping website. Think of it as the home shopping network on Blazor. Maybe we call it Blazed Shopping or something like that. The tasks for this module will include, if I flip back over, configuring routing in your Blazor WebAssembly app so that it works properly once it's deployed to the static hosting platform, Azure Static Web Apps in this case. You will also work through provisioning an Azure Static Web Apps instance and creating a API with Azure Functions, again, based on .NET Core 3.1. This module will eventually be updated to .NET 5.0. And then finally, configuring a CI/CD pipeline based on GitHub Actions. The purpose of that pipeline in this module will be, you will be asked to open a pull request with a base branch of main, and that GitHub action will then be triggered when a pull request is opened against main. The Blazor app and API will then be built and deployed out to Azure Static Web Apps. As we mentioned earlier, Learn modules have knowledge checks. And so if I navigate over to that, you get a feel for what that looks like. The goal here is to reinforce the lessons learned throughout the module. If you
Some
complete
people,
this, go ahead.
I'm sorry, Scott. I was just going to say some people get very kind of invested in their knowledge check questions, wouldn't you say, Scott? We've had people. So Scott and I have spent many hours co-writing some of these Microsoft Learn modules, not this one, but others. And we get the feedback. We get to see the feedback that people submit on these Learn modules, and we have seen people get really I'll just say this is kind of nasty about these knowledge check questions.
Really?
We had one guy that I say guy. I'm making an assumption. Could be any person. They something about I forget what they said exactly, but it's you dirty trick questions, and I forget what it was. But they were not happy that we made them work for their experience points.
Yeah, I think part of the reason for that is this is a gamified system. If you complete the knowledge check questions successfully, the reward is an achievement badge, and that's your bragging rights. Like, hey, I successfully made it through this module and learned the concepts. But yeah, to your point, there is some nasty feedback that comes through. This knowledge check page is by far the most difficult portion of a module to author. It's a lot
It's
like
hard to
trying
write.
it's a lot like, trying to come up with good questions for a Microsoft certification exam. So,
because I'm guessing like the questions you want to have here kind of should summarize like what's the most important thing I want you to get out of this module. Like after you've done the exercises and read the content, out of everything else in the world, like these are the things I want you to know when you leave here. I'm guessing that's like the motivation, right?
yeah, that is the motivation here.
Yep.
Yeah. So with that, why don't we move over to the hallway track and have our conversation today with Niels.
Let's do it.
Awesome.
All right. So as I mentioned in the opening of today's show, we are very fortunate today to have Niels with us to talk about publishing a Blazor WebAssembly app out to a static hosting platform. In this case, GitHub Pages was the focus. But, there are other options as well, like Cloudflare Pages, which is a newer offering. You could go out to places like Netlify or even Azure Static Web Apps which I was just talking about. So Niels, where do we want to start with this conversation? Is there any anything you wanted to share with the audience to get the conversation going?
Well, real quick before Niels does that, I just got to call out Niels. We talked about this before the show, but I want to call out for the audience. Niels' awesome animated background. This thing is so cool. I keep watching the little villagers go by and stuff. I'm digging it.
Yeah, this is where I stay safe from the pandemic.
That's not a bad place to be. I don't blame you.
All right, I have a little presentation here, but most of the time will be spent on demos. So what I want to show today is the different steps to deploy Blazor WebAssembly to GitHub Pages. We'll take it one step at a time. The blog post I have takes you from 0 to all the way to the end in one step using GitHub Actions. And this presentation or this walkthrough will be more of a with all the steps in between, without skipping on any of the knowledge that you know after learning everything. So I'll skip this. I already introduced myself. A little bit about GitHub Pages. GitHub Pages is one of many static website hosting services, one of the free ones. It supports custom domains, and originally it was built for Jekyll, and I believe it was only Jekyll that was supported, but they quickly added any static site in the future just by providing static files to the GitHub repository. It's free, but there's no SLA, so this is really a good idea to put documentation, to put hobby projects, but definitely not something that you want to, be certain about that it has a certain uptime. And there are some usage limits and prohibited uses that you should go through yourself.
Niels, can you back up just the one slide for me real quick?
Yeah.
I did want to call something out. Your first bullet point where we talk about static site hosting service.
Mm-hmm.
So just to clarify for viewers who might not know the distinction between like static and dynamic when it comes to hosting, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so with PHP, with .NET, with many of these programming languages, you can respond to HTTP requests and dynamically create a response to that. With static websites, that is not possible. You basically create your static website files beforehand, and they don't change. You serve them as they are uploaded to the server.
So the server is just sitting there. It's not really doing anything. There's no like server, there's no like ASP code or anything. It's just like serving files basically.
Yep, it's a static file service. Yep.
Gotcha.
And I think there's an important distinction there to make too, because like today we're talking about Blazor WebAssembly, but there's also Blazor Server, which needs a server, right? And it's not all completely statically generated. You know what I mean? So like the deployment models that you're going to talk about would be completely different using Blazor WebAssembly versus Blazor server.
And so you mentioned some of these alternatives, and there's many more than there's been listed here, but these are all the services that I've covered in my blog posts, except for DigitalOcean. I was going to publish that today, but instead I was preparing for this presentation, so I'll publish that a couple of days later probably. So there's Azure Static Web Apps, which is fantastic. AWS Amplify and LFI, they're also fantastic. And then you have a lot of others that really provide what you need without many of the features that these other platforms provide, but they get the job done. And there's 3 types of GitHub pages, and mostly the difference is how the URL is constructed. So if you create a specific GitHub repository, I believe it's profile or something, then the static website will be hosted at your username, your GitHub username .github.io. The same for your organization. It's organization.github.io, and there's no subdirectory there. While for any other repository, there will be the repository name will be used as a subdirectory. And so whatever you put in the root of your repository, it will be put into the subdirectory of this your username.github.io. And so the first thing we're going to look at is how are we going to create these a GitHub Pages site without Jekyll. And we're not going to involve Blazor yet. We're just going to create a simple HTML file and see how it's being deployed. And you create a GitHub repository for it, commit static files, then configure which branch should be used as a source, and then wait for GitHub to deploy. And this is the hardest part of this presentation, is waiting for GitHub to deploy. And there's a lot of caching involved in GitHub Pages, which can really be painful for demonstrations. So we'll see.
We're praying for you.
All right, so I'm going to create a directory here, .NET docs demo, show demo. I'm going to keep this on the clipboard. Paste it. And I'm going to open up Visual Studio Code to create that HTML file. So I'm going to call it index.html, and index.html is usually the default for most web servers and static site hosts. And I'm going to use this emmet abbreviation to generate the basic boilerplate. Say hello world. Now we want to create a GitHub repository. I'm going to say git init, git add everything, and just to check what's the status. So there's one new file, index.html. So we're going to commit that file. And I don't have a GitHub repository yet, so I'm going to use the GitHub CLI instead of the web interface to create that as quickly as possible. Just saying gh.repo create. I'm just going to accept all the defaults.
That GitHub CLI is so handy. Like I've been starting to use it a lot more lately, and in my head I was like, why would I need a CLI for GitHub? And then when you use it, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I really need a CLI for GitHub. Like this is really fun to use.
Yeah, looks like there's an error that hasn't happened in the past times I've tried it. So I might have to configure this origin. Normally the origin would be pre-configured. I just have to make sure this is done correctly. Paste. All right, that should be course corrected. Right, I have my index.html file here. Now in these settings, you can find a section that says GitHub Pages. And under the GitHub Pages sections, there's a source property where you can select which branch you want to use. Now I'm not going to select the main branch. because I'm going to create a new branch that's called gh-pages, and that's the default name for GitHub Pages branch. In the past, you had to call it, and this section wasn't available. But I still like to use that since it's kind of like a default that's accepted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say git branch gh-pages to create that branch, and then check it out. And then I'll have to push that. Just a second. I'm going to cheat a little bit. So I got to set my remote. Git push, but with set upstream. Origin pages. You have to do this specific, like this extra argument whenever you push a branch that hasn't been created yet on the Git server. So that's why I had to do that. Now that I've created that, GitHub will automatically select that branch as the source, just because it has that historical context of GH-pages. And it says your site is ready to be published at, and then the URL, and it will become green when it actually has been deployed. So you just refresh, and then it's green. Now, a different way to see your deployment is to go to the homepage, environments, and you can also see the activity log where it's been deployed here. So I'm going to click on View Deployment, and here we see Hello World. So that's our static website. So any questions so far?
So basically what you've done so far is you've just made the static HTML page and put it out on basically just a web server that'll just serve it with no other fancy server processes going on. Just here's the file, right?
Yep.
Gotcha.
So I guess I do have a question. Let's say there's a need to use a default page other than index HTML. In more robust web servers like IIS, that's configurable. You could set it to default.html, for example. Is that file name configurable here in GitHub Pages?
That's something I would have to look up. Maybe, but I'm sure it's probably going to be index.html.
Got it. Yeah, and I can't think of a use case. Just trying to think as a developer, trying to think of ways I could break this.
Well, and he mentioned earlier when he created the file as index.html, and he said, "Oh, this is what most web servers use." I started thinking, well, unless you're IIS.
Yeah, IIS has some funny default names on top of the. I think they do index.html too, but they have a bunch of others as well, like IIS start.html. Excuse me.
So now I'm going to have to check out that GitHub CLI. That looks really nice.
Yeah, it really increases the flow of demos like this, so you don't have to go into the web UI as regularly. To add the Blazor wasm to this GitHub Pages now, there's only a few steps. You have to do a .NET publish of your Blazor wasm application, and that will generate all these static files for you. And then you have to somehow get all those static files into the GitHub Pages branch. And then there's actually a lot of hidden steps in here. This is really where the most of the time goes, is fix whatever's broken. So you'll have to do some extra things which we'll address. All right.
Now, a question there for you, Niels. So you're calling out the .NET publish command, which assumes you're using the .NET CLI for this. Now, what if you, let's say you're a developer who just lives in Visual Studio all day? Are there any things to be aware of when trying to publish from your IDE, like Visual Studio or VS for Mac?
So the same arguments that you give to the CLI will be asked to you if you, what we'll essentially be doing is doing like a folder publish. I think that's what it's called in Visual Studio. where you publish to a folder, not to like an IIS site or Azure. It's just to a folder. And the two arguments you have to provide at least is what configuration do you want, so debug or release or something else, and where do you want it to live. And so it's essentially the same in this case.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for calling that out.
So I'm going to go back to the main branch and remove that index.html file. And we don't have a Blazor WebAssembly application yet, so we're going to create one using .NET New Blazor wasm. And since we're using Git, we will want to ignore a lot of the .NET specific files. And .NET also has a .NET New Git ignore option, which will create that git ignore file with all the defaults that Visual Studio also comes with. Just to ignore the bin file, the DLLs, etc., all the output files that we don't need to track in Git. And we're going to add all the new source code to Git. Let's check the status. It's quite a bit. And I'm going to commit all these files at Blazor wasm git push. Now for the .NET publish command, because we're doing this manually on file, I'm going to do .NET publish -c release. This release command will make sure that everything is as optimal as possible. So there will be some optimizations as part of that. And then -o is the output. I'm going to put that outside of my current folder in a new folder, temp release, just to make it easier when I switch branches and then manually copy it in.
While we're waiting
I'll-
for this, I do have another question. So
Yep.
Niels, it looks like you're using ASP.NET Core 5.0 app here. Does everything you're showing here apply to earlier versions of Blazor wasm?
Yep, the original blog post was written in 3.1, and everything that I'm showing here should work just the same in 3.1. You do have to change some of the version numbers in some of the scripts that I'm going to show in the future, but that's it.
Awesome.
I'm going to go into that temp release folder just to show you what's in here. And so we can see all these DLLs both with Broadly and gzip, although GitHub Pages doesn't actually use this. And that's one way that Azure Static Web Apps is actually a better place to host this, because Azure Static Web Apps actually knows about this .br and .gz, and it will serve that if requested by the browser. There's some sample data, CSS, JavaScript, and then the most important, index.html. Now there's one file in here that's not a static website file, and that's this web.config. And this is actually for hosting this on IIS, which we won't be doing, so we can just ignore this. We'll grab all the files that are under the root folder. And let's see if this works. I didn't try this beforehand. But I installed this .NET utility called .NET Serve, which is a static file server utility. I believe it's by Nate McMaster. I hope I don't mispronounce his name.
Oh, that's correct.
Yep.
Yeah,
So you need to be in
Nate used to work on the .NET engineering team. He's now, I think, over at AWS, but he did some fantastic work for the team.
Cool. And so that's a small utility for serving static files. So this is like an easy way to quickly test out if this is going to work properly. And so you can see the Blazor wasm application. I did want to show this just before showing deploying it to GitHub. You can oh, this is something I got to figure out later. Either way, it is being served. I go back to the show. And I want to switch branches back to my GitHub Pages branch. Check out GH Pages. And I'm going to remove all of these things here. Don't need them anymore. -R. Then before we actually copy in all those files, we do have to add this git attributes file. That's one of the pitfalls that I'm not going to demonstrate how painful it is to figure out. I'm just going to show you how to do it because this can take a lot of time. So .git attributes is a file that tells Git how to treat certain files. And in this case, what we're saying is all files should be treated as binary, meaning that Git shouldn't mess around with the file, just take them as is. If you don't do this, depending on the file, for example, the HTML file, Git will change the line feeds and some encoding, etc. And Blazor WASM could be complaining about that because it does integrity checking. And so that's not something you want to have.
So
You
to
know,
say
I know
that
by
again,
default, whenever you do .NET new projects, I think you get a git ignore file by default. It'd be interesting if maybe we should start including a .git attributes file as well inside of those things.
Maybe. This is useful for GitHub Pages because you're going to deploy, essentially you're going to use your source code, a separate branch source code as the source for your output. If you would use like Azure Static Web Apps, it's actually going to build it and not store it in source control again, so it won't mess around with the files after compile time.
Yeah.
So in that case, you don't need it.
I think one thing that could be useful there is maybe in the Blazor WASM project template in the .NET new experience, you provide another option you can pass to the templating engine that would add a git attributes file if set to true.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea too.
So I'm going to commit this, and now that that's here, I'm actually going to start moving over those files from the root folder. And so, yeah, now I have all these files here, and I'll add all of them again to Git. Finally, we're going to push them to GitHub. Now, because that's a lot more files, the deployment is going to take a little bit longer. It's still pushing it.
While we're waiting for that, there's some discussion in the chat that I'd like to address. So there was a question about, Blazor versus React. So Blazor is not intended to render something like React obsolete. The two actually play together quite nicely. There's a JavaScript interop feature in Blazor, which means the two can happily coexist in the same application. Your SPA framework of choice, be it React, Angular, Vue, along with Blazor.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those use the right tool for you kind of thing, right? Like you could use JavaScript or you could use Blazor, you could use both of them together. So kind of like what Scott said, it's not a replacement, but I think it's just more so, hey, we know this .NET thing and we know this C# thing, you know what I mean? Can we use that to be more productive, like in that in-browser scenario?
Yep. While we're talking, GitHub did deploy the application. And now we're going to run into some of the issues that I was referencing in the slide with the trash can.
Is this from the caching that you mentioned earlier, or what's the cause of this?
Yeah, in this case, it's not. If you look at this URL, you may notice that it's actually missing the subfolder. And that's because out of the box, Blazor wasm Blazor wasm comes with that base attribute here. And so this base attribute will force all the files to be searched for by this instead of this. So it should be this. Now this file should actually be available here, but that could be because of something else. Let me quickly open the Explorer up, check if that's files here. All the files are here. Oh, actually, I actually raced a little bit ahead of myself. Let me show you a CSS file instead. It should, there we go. So with the CSS file, you can see it is resolved when you add the subdirectory, but by default, because of that base tag, Chrome will look for it over here, which is not what we want. So what you can do is subdirectory as part of the output. So we're going to update this, commit it. We'll redeploy.
I love that it's one of those shared experiences that all developers know. There it is.
And so hopefully caching won't be hurting us at this point, but it does take us some time now and then. All right, so we did successfully redeploy this, and you can see now we see loading, and it's styled a little bit differently. It's still not working, but we can see that at least our CSS has been loaded, and many of the 404 errors are gone. Now the next 404 error is for this file, Blazor WebAssembly.js. And the reason for that is actually that this folder starts with an underscore. And so it's actually the entire folder that hasn't been deployed. By default, GitHub Pages still assumes that the GitHub Pages website is a Jekyll website, and it will ignore any folders with an underscore, because in Jekyll that's purposely done that way to not be deployed. So we can tell Pages to just not treat this as a Jekyll website by saying no Jekyll. So we'll add that as well. Push. Now it should redeploy, including the folders with an underscore. And we'll have to wait again. Any questions?
So that's really all you have to do to configure GitHub Pages to not do the Jekyll processing, is just include that no Jekyll file.
Yep.
Okay.
We do have a question in the chat here. I'll put this up on the screen. So the question is, would it be preferable to have a GitHub action which builds and pushes to the GitHub page branch instead of doing this locally?
Absolutely. If you can do it that way, do it, or any other build automation tool. I'm showing it manually step by step just to show you the pain and the roadblocks that you'll run into, because it's even more painful to run into these roadblocks inside of a automation tool like GitHub Actions, because you have to run it over and over and over again, and you have to make your changes into that GitHub workflow file and then check it in, and then it runs troubleshoot. That's like a very painful process. What I advise for doing automation is get it working locally, get the steps in your CLI right, and then transfer it over. And then it's a lot easier to get that to work.
And then our friend David Pine also makes a good point in the chat that I wanted to bring up here. So David's advising not to mix something like React with Blazor, specifically because of the routing collisions that could occur between the two frameworks. Fair point. I've definitely
Yeah.
experienced that pain. I know exactly what he's talking about.
All right. I made a mistake. When I was making this Node.jl file, it added the .txt extension. That's not supposed to be that extension. I'm gonna fix that now.
It's always good to show those types of errors, right? Because
Mhm.
I know I'm probably going to do that. Someone else is probably going to do that. And so when they say, "Hey, we watched this video and I saw this thing, but mine doesn't work like his does," you're like, "Oh, okay, that's what it was."
And we do have another question that I'll ask Niels.
Mhm.
Gets to I'll put it up on the screen here, the Brotli and gzip files that you showed earlier. Is that a big enough of a reason to use Azure Static Web Apps instead of GitHub Pages?
I would say it's a nice feature. It's not like something that I would switch over for, but there's a lot of other features in Azure Static Web Apps that I would switch over for. In general, I would say that Azure Static Web Apps is just more capable, more feature rich, and it has integration with Azure Functions as well. But some very important things are part of Azure Static Web Apps, such as the routing. There's a more robust routing built-in, and GitHub Pages pretty much doesn't have routing, which I'll show you in a sec. There's probably some other features that I haven't mentioned, but yeah.
I think you mentioned SLA earlier on in the show. That might be a reason why you would go with something like Static Web Apps.
Yep. And it's showing up, finally. Now, we see that it's working, but when I refresh, I'm getting actually a 404. And that's because the path has changed. And when I refresh, it will try to get a file. And it's going to look for a file here that says index.html. That's not this. That's not the current. Currently, there's no file there, so that's why it's showing a 404. One way to fix that is to copy the index.html file to the 404.html file, and that's another thing that's documented by GitHub Pages, that if you can't find a file at the requested URL, it will fall back to this 404.html file. And so by copying index.html, we essentially are using our Blazor WebAssembly application to handle that 404, and it will show the WebAssembly 404 instead of this this 404 page. So let me add this. Everything, and then
Quick reminder, we've had it a couple of times in the chat now. All recordings of this show are available on the official .NET channel on YouTube. So check us out there at youtube.com/dotnet.
And now that this 404.html page has been deployed, we can see that it actually resolves to the Blazor WebAssembly application, even after we refresh at the /counter. Now, something to pay attention to is that even though this worked, if you look at the network tab and refresh, you can see even though it returns the that file, it is still giving a status code of 404. So this is going to be very bad for search engine optimization. So if you have some content in subpaths that is important for search engines to be indexed, then this is not a good solution for you. So one way to resolve that is to either manually copy even more index.html files all over the place. And in that case, GitHub Pages will resolve it with a status 200, or use some pre-rendering techniques I have a blog post on one of those ways you could do that. I used a Node pre-render tool for that. I saw a great blog post by Andrew Locke, and he had a really cool solution which was more reliant on .NET. So there's different ways to pre-render this, and I would suggest you go in that direction.
So then, as someone that's familiar with like the traditional path that we've taken when it comes to ASP.NET, so maybe I'm a web forms developer, MVC developer, whatever the case is, why would I not just use that instead of pre-rendering a static asset if I know, if I know I'm going to need it up front anyway in that fashion to be, accessible via, search engines and for SEO and all of that. Like, why would I not just do that instead of, having a static app of any sort?
Why not use just not use Blazor WASM and use something else?
Well, because you're saying
asking?
now, like, we have to do some sort of pre-rendering, right, for these static assets so that it could be optimized for the search engine. But if we just built it in something like MVC or some backend technology, it would just work, right? Because that's what we've always been doing. So so why would I not choose one versus? Why would I not just use MVC or something like that?
Yeah, and that's one way that MVC and these other platforms are king, in my opinion. They shine a little more. They're just better optimized and they're more robust. They're more familiar. How should I say this? Yeah, they're like in the more classic indexable way of doing things. And so this is not just for Blazor. This is for any SPA framework. You're going to run into this challenge. And you're going to have to do pre-rendering or server-side rendering. But you can't do server-side rendering if you're using a static web app in this case. So,
yeah. And I guess, too, if you use a traditional web framework that renders on the back end, it's probably a little bit heavier, right? And if you don't want to do some of that heavier processing, you just need something lightweight with 1 or 2 pages maybe that are, pre-rendered, then maybe that makes a lot more sense than taking up a lot of that load up front.
Using static sites is just so cheap.
That's
can be cheaper than free.
My money in my pocket.
So, and there's of course a ton of performance benefits as well. So, so next step related to the question that was asked earlier. So, how do you do this in GitHub Actions so that you can automate it more easily? I think we have 12 minutes left, so we'll see if we can get to it. So GitHub Actions is a workflow automation engine where you can do continuous integration and continuous deployment and many more things. But we'll be using it for CI/CD in this case. And it runs on hosted images like Windows, Linux, Mac, or your own images. There's free. There's a lot that you get for free. But if you need more build minutes and support, you can get a paid plan. It's written in YAML. And the awesome thing is there's so many existing custom actions. So we'll be using a couple of those in the demo. But it's really great that you can just use somebody else's pre-written, pre-developed tool and save a ton of time. And so for this, I'm going to head over to GitHub Actions. I'm going to say set up a workflow yourself. So we're going to start from 0. Let me copy over the YAML file that I created beforehand. I was trying this yesterday and I couldn't scroll to the top. I don't know if you're noticing this. It's line 4 here, but I can when I scroll, when I zoom out. So bear with me that it's a little zoomed out. Yeah.
I wonder if that's a browser extension that's conflicting with it.
Maybe, although I don't have any extensions on this thing. So this is a workflow GitHub Actions file, and you say the name here, which will show up in the UI. And this workflow will run on every push to the main branch. That's what this says. And now that I've gone through that, I can zoom in so people can see it better. And so what it's going to run is the jobs specified down below. And I have only one job called deploy to GitHub Pages, which runs on Ubuntu. So some of the commands that I showed earlier will have to use Linux commands instead. And the first step of this job will be to check out my code. And it's going to check out, if I don't specify any parameters, it's going to check out the default branch code, which is the main, so not the GH pages. Now, the second step that we're going to execute is set up .NET Core SDK. And this is a GitHub action provided by GitHub themselves. And you can specify which version of .NET that you want by adding this argument. Now, I do believe that the image, that the Ubuntu latest image already has .NET on it, but I do recommend that you specify which version that you're using, because the Ubuntu latest image is going to be updated, and so maybe the code that you wrote for .NET 5 will not be exactly, like there might be some issues in .NET 6 or something, and it will automatically use .NET 6. So by specifying it here, it will make sure that .NET 5 is installed. And I'm going to actually check which version I'm using at the moment. I think it's info. Yeah. So the version that I'm using is 5.0.201. There we go. And this is also where you would specify 3.1 whatever your version is if you are using the 3.1 version of .NET. Then we run the .NET publish command. And in addition to the cno command, I added this no logo just to limit the amount of output that's being output to the console. And I'm struggling to get here again with the scrolling. The next step that we're going to have to take is to update the base tag, which we did manually earlier, but we need to do this automatically now. So I'm using the sed command, which stands for stream editor, which is a Linux command to modify text in files. And this -i will say, specifies that you should update this in place. So whatever modifications that are made to the file should be saved to the same file. And then you specify using this weird syntax what to find, which in this case is base href with the /, and replace it with the subdirectory. Now the subdirectory should actually be .NET docs show demo. So let's update that. And then the next step is to copy the index.html file to 404, which is the same thing that we did earlier. And I'm going to have to zoom out even more. I apologize. We also have to add the node.jql file again. It's easy to create an empty file using Linux with the touch command. So this will just create an empty file. And then the last step, let me just remove some of this temporarily. I'm going to use an existing GitHub action developed by somebody else, which makes it really easy to deploy to a different branch. And so this is specifically made to deploy to GitHub Pages. And this GitHub action needs my GitHub token. By default, they don't have access to your GitHub token. And the GitHub token will give them the necessary permissions to make modifications to your GitHub repository. So I have to pass this in so that they have access to it. And then I specify which branch I'm using and where the location is of this deployed Blazor wasm application. And earlier, I removed it. I deployed it to the folder release. And so the files that I want to upload to GitHub Pages are under release root. That should be it. And then when you commit this, this will start showing up underneath the Actions tab, deploy to GitHub Pages, and we'll start running.
We do have a question in the chat that I hope to get to here. So our friend Curious Drive is asking how to make this app SEO friendly. I think you talked about this earlier on, and that's where the pre-rendering came into play. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. So there's actually more to it than I said earlier. The first thing that you'll want is to pre-render, and that's specifically to GitHub Pages because of the 404 status codes that are being returned. In a different platform like Azure Static Web Apps, you'll be able to set up routing, which will return the HTTP status code as 200. So you'll be fine in that case. You don't need pre-rendering necessarily. Now, for any SPA, including Blazor WASM, it requires JavaScript to be executed. And a lot of search engines are not good at executing JavaScript. The only search engine that is kind of good at it is Google Search. And I actually tested this out with Blazor WASM. They actually index a Blazor WASM application, which is pretty awesome. But depending on your application, how heavy it is, it might not work as well. If it's really heavy, the search index, the Google search crawler might just give up and say, never mind. And so it's still a good idea to pre-render either way. But even more importantly, for Bing and for Yandex and for Baidu and for DuckDuckGo and whoever else is out there who don't even execute JavaScript. So make sure that you do pre-rendering for them too. All right. While we were talking, the entire workflow finished, and you could see it running in real time, which is really cool. Let's just take a look at some of these. So it set up the .NET SDK with version 5.0. Then it did a publish to this folder. Then we updated this file. We copied the file. We added a Node.jl, and then we used this GitHub action to deploy it to GitHub Pages. And you can see some nice output from that action in case you have some issues. And here's some of the output that you see from the files that are being uploaded. So some are being deleted, like the Git attributes in this case is no longer necessary because it's not being committed the same way anymore. This actions will take care of it, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. And that's it. So let's take a look at the environments again. It was deployed 2 minutes ago, and it's still working. So maybe not the most cool thing to show, because it's just the same, but it is still working, which is a success. I don't think there's enough time, but to demonstrate this, you could just say hello world on the main branch. You can add the change, git add, git commit, push. Now this will automatically run again under GitHub Actions. It took 4 minutes, so we won't make it in time. But essentially what will happen is it will automatically be deployed, and the title here in the tab will change to Hello World. And that's everything I have to show.
Awesome.
That was beautifully timed.
I was getting worried a little bit.
No, you shared a lot with us. Looks like folks in the chat were trying to deploy to GitHub Pages with their Blazor WASM app, and some of the folks admitted, okay, I see where I'm going wrong now. Thank you for sharing this information. So you have unblocked some people in our chat out in the .NET community. Thank you for that. One last question we wanted to get to here from the chat. Should you have a step that clears the GitHub Pages branch first in case files are removed from the application? I view that as sort of a clean step.
All right, let me reread this. Should you have a step to step clear? Okay, I see. So when you do it manually, you might have to do that. That's one of the things I did as well, was I did the RM and then *R to remove all the files. and then I copied over all the Blazor wasm application output files. But you got to be careful that you don't remove that get attributes file, because then it's going to mess up the line feeding and the integrity checks won't pass in Blazor wasm. Now, if you're using that GitHub action that I showed you, it's going to take care of that. So you don't have to worry about that.
All right.
Great.
So it looks like Niels has a slide up here, places you can find his resources out on the web. Definitely
So Scott,
take note of that.
So Scott, before we go, what are we doing next week? Or don't we have a special show next week?
Yes, so next week is the most important day in any C# developer's life. We are hosting an Ask Me Anything session with Mads Torgerson, PM on the C# team, Bill Wagner, content developer on C#, and John Skeet, who you may have heard of before. We'll be taking questions beforehand for that particular session. Details for that are still being sorted out, but tune in. It'll be your opportunity to ask questions of the C# juggernauts.
Awesome.
Thanks again, Niels, for sharing everything today. And thanks to our viewers for tuning in and for your loyalty to the show. See you next week.
Thanks for having me.